Hello to all the listeners and welcome to CEC Gurukul Live Lectures. Dear listeners, dear viewers, today we will be looking at a very important topic, that is evolution of international economic system. Now, whenever we try to understand the international economic system, its evolution has its own significance. Whenever we try to understand a concept, evolution gives us an idea of the trajectory and the historical antecedents the concept has taken to evolve. When we look at international economic system, it has its own unique history. And when we try to look at this history, we will be trying to look at it from the contemporary and the modern period. Now, the current international economic system that we are trying to look and understand was established in the mid-1940s. Whenever we try to decipher the international economic system, there have been nations who have played an important role. Now, in the current international economic system, the United States has been a dominant leader in the sense of designing and enforcing the international economic rules. Any system, when we try to look at the economic system, the currency plays an important role. And in the international economic system, the US dollar has been cornerstone of the international monetary system. Now, there have been debates upon the role of United States as a dominant leader to design and enforce international economic rules, as well as over the role of US dollar as the cornerstone of international monetary system. Now, when we look at the international economic system, there have been international organizations that have played an important role for maintaining international economic order. During the course of the lecture, we will be trying to understand their role also, namely the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. Now, whenever we try to look at the international economic system, the Bretton Woods system has played an important role. When we try to understand the Bretton Woods system, the Bretton Woods Conference, which was held in July 1944 in the New Hampshire of United States of America, has played an important role. As a part of the deliberations at the Bretton Woods Conference, the result was the creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Trade Organization. Now, Bretton Woods Conference is having its own unique significance in the sense of larger transnational efforts in order to bring parity, rules, and in order to have an effective platform in dealing with issues and problems of global trade and global finance. Now, Bretton Woods Conference has a very important name that we must always try to understand. That is the name of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who tries to say that the attempt at the Bretton Woods Conference was to seek a common measure, a common standard, a common rule applicable to each and not irksome to any. Whenever we try to understand macroeconomics, the perspective of J.M. Keynes is very important to understand for all our students, for all the learners alike. And this quote of the aims of the Bretton Woods Conference comes from the ideas of J.M. Keynes. Now, before we take the evolution of international economic system forward via the Bretton Woods conference and later on the Bretton Woods institutions, we have to see it from certain preceding events also. Now the World War I, the First World War, which was primarily a European phenomena between the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente, was a turning point in the evolution of world political economy also. Do you know, dear listeners, that what was the structure of the pre-1914 international financial system? Yes, you guessed it right. It was the gold, which stood as a key currency standard which centered upon sterling. Now always remember, economics has a huge link with the operation of political power, and this is where international political economy has certain answers for us also when we try to understand the First World War. Now with the First World War being the first war which may be primarily within the European continent, but it had a huge impact in terms of loss of billions of lives and property. And within this, the international economic system too had its own impact. Britain acted to the world as a monetary manager. Let me quote Cohen for you, who argues that the classical gold standard was a sterling standard, and this definitely could be seen as a hegemonic regime. So whenever we hear about Pax Britannica, somewhere we have to see that how Britain acted as a world monetary manager, because the gold standard definitely was a sterling standard, and pound sterling was given huge amount of stability, because of which the United Kingdom or the Britain was in a position to play the role of a hegemonic regime. Once again, when we try to look at the time period from 1870 to 1914, this was the era where the height of gold standard reached its apex. Gold was the basis of international payments amongst the leading countries until the First World War. So here we see that how First World War definitely had its own contribution in the evolution of international monetary system. Now major countries also utilize the operation of the gold standard to fix the value of gold to their currencies. Now in 1914, when the First World War broke out, its impact on the international political economic system was that this gold standard collapsed. Now with the First World War starting, with the assassination of Crown Prince of Serbia, there were huge intercontinental rivalry, European rivalry. Always remember how the mutual fear and distrust was one of the primary causes of the First World War. This lack of trust led Europe on the bulk of war. Now once this First World War breaks, gold standard collapses. Gold standard fixed exchange rate mechanism was replaced by something complete opposite. What we can say is absolute opposite, an exchange rate system that was floating. Now of course there are concerns, that the debates even today that we shall see towards as the lecture proceeds, the debate is still on upon the exchange rate mechanism, whether fixed exchange rate mechanism was better or whether floating exchange rate mechanism is good. So the impact of wartime uncertainties was felt, because war leads to a time wherein mutual fear and distrust has its impact on every sector of our lives, be it political, be it society. And the post-war years, once the First World War gets over, there was inflation in all countries. Price rise was one of the reasons for economic crisis in most countries. Therefore, there were growing calls to reform the international economic system. And also at the same time, where we saw in the post-World War phenomena, where gold standard definitely made it a hegemonic regime of Great Britain in the pre-First World War. In the post-First World War, there was this phase of rise of emerging market economies. At the same time, we have to see that with this rise of emerging market economies, every time one of the features of this international economic system is that crisis raises questions. So be it be the Great Depression in 1930s, or be it be the recent subprime crisis in the United States, there have been questions that have been raised about the effectiveness of monetary policy, financial regulations, and the larger issue of international reserve system. So therefore, there have been, whenever we try to understand the international economic system, time and again, be it be the post-First World War, be it be the post-Second World War, be it be the post-Cold War, or be it be post the contemporary issues, there have been issues of reform. This is why we say the international economic system has never been static. The only thing constant in the international economic system is its variability of issues, of stability, and this is why there have been issues of reform to adapt to suit the new global economic and market conditions, to have a system that can be adapted in order to meet the challenges of time, be it be post First World War, post Second World War, or post Cold War, for the new global economic realities and market conditions. So, world economy, dear listeners, that we are witnessing right now is very different from what it was in the First World War time, in the Second World War time, or during the Cold War time. With the end of the Second World War, most developing economies collapsed and received financial assistance. Now, Second World War has its own history with how the seeds of the impact of the First World War led to the Second World War. You all know how the Treaty of Versailles, how the entire Treaty of Versailles led to the start of the crisis that led to the Second World War. And impact of this Second World War was that most developing economies collapsed, and there was this regime of financial aid and help. Today, what we are seeing that these emerging economies are already important players in the world economy. If it was Britain that played an important role in the pre-First World era, if it was United States that played an important role in post-First World War, post-Second World War, and during the Cold War, it was USA versus USSR. Today, our international economic system is no longer bipolar. Today, we are witnessing multipolarity with emerging market economies that are already important players in the world economy. Let's go back to history to understand how and what kind of efforts have been made in order to instill stability in the operation and functioning of international economic system. Let's understand what happened at the Geneva Conference from April 10 until May 1922. Now 1922 is an important year for us to understand, because that's the year where a lot of efforts are going on to stabilize the world in order to cater to the drastic aftermath of the First World War. Representatives of 34 nations, including the great powers, and here except the United States, they all met and they recommended the worldwide adoption of a gold exchange standard in order to centralize and coordinate the demand for gold. They attempted this idea of gold exchange standard to prevent the purchasing power of gold fluctuating, which could occur where a number of countries could simultaneously compete to secure the reserves. So what we see here is that in the post-First World War scenario, the United States emerges as major creditor. And also remember what we just discussed, how the Treaty of Versailles laid the seeds of future tensions and crisis, which had its final shape in the form of the Second World War. Now, the American insistence on repayment of war debts was a major source of international instability in the 1920s and early 1930s. With a lot of countries facing inflation, the United States was one of the major powers, and it insisted on repayment of the war debts. Now, therein, what you find here is, with this entire production and industrial scenario witnessing crisis, Great Depression of 1930s too added more. There was the complete collapse of international monetary system. At the same time, economic nationalism making nations look inwards, trying to secure their economy, trying to cut down on interdependence, competitive exchange rate, the entire phenomena of devaluation, formation of competing monetary blocs, and above all, complete absence of international cooperation was one of the significant aftermath of the First World War, which the international economic system had to bear. Now, let me tell you, dear listeners, that this entire paradigm of economic nationalism, absence of international cooperation with respect to benefits of a free trade world where there's like an idea of a borderless economy, these questions, they were raised in the post First World War phenomena as well as in the contemporary time, wherein you must be seeing whenever you try to read the newspapers, this entire syndrome of deglobalization, and whether do we really need a protectionist economy, or where does economic nationalism really stand in terms of the larger liberal argument. Now, reconstruction after the First World War therefore can be said to be somewhere leading the way to the start of the Second World War. The planning for post-war monetary reconstructions was definitely done, and therein you see that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were launched as the two pillars of the new international financial system. They both originated, one of the similarities between the IMF and the World Bank was that they both are post-Second World War institutions. They both followed the United Nations Monetary and Financial Cooperation at the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that we just saw at the beginning of the lecture in 1944. Now, the Bretton Woods system has its own history, and this history needs to be understood because the questions that history posed are even being debated today in the understanding of the evolution of international monetary system. This Bretton Woods system originated as a compromise between two competing ideologies of Henry Dexter White of the United States Treasury and Lord Keynes of the Great Britain. Their interwar experience gave us important lessons, and one of the important lessons this war experience gave to several nations was the determination to prevent a repetition of previous mistake. Now, the aims of the Bretton Woods system are primarily clear. The Bretton Woods proposed to put in place a mechanism that would enable countries in financial crisis to reach out to international credits and, of course, avert serious economic collapse, avoid external constraints imposed by national economies by gold standard. What was needed was flexibility to support nationally decided policy and to provide enough stability to avoid competitive devaluations. Now, industrial production technologies in the post-war period created a capitalist world market. The Bretton Woods system was therefore about rules for international trade and commerce. Now, 1990s is very important to understand that we have come a long way from the Bretton Woods conference, because in the contemporary phase of 1990s we have seen the emergence of process of globalization, which in itself is essential to understand how the evolution of international economic system is not static and having its own contours. The Bretton Woods Conference established International Monetary Fund to alleviate the problems of international liquidity, that is, to help the member countries to meet their balance of payments deficit and to strive to achieve international monetary stability, tackle international monetary instability. The IBRD that you all must have heard, that is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to help the reconstruction and development of various national economies by providing long-term capital assistance. And of course, the International Trade Organization that we called as ITO, to work towards the liberalization of trade, because always remember, global trade and global finance have been the two main anchors of any economic system. Now, let's understand the functions of the IMF, which is a Bretton Woods institution, post Second World War institution. The International Monetary Fund tries to look at the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, unemployment, and real income. It strives to achieve exchange stability. It attempts to eliminate foreign exchange restrictions. The IMF tries to provide loans to member countries in order to correct maladjustments in their balance of payments. Now, so therefore, when we try to summarize the main functions of IMF, there are primarily three: regulatory, financial, and consultative. When we try to look at the structure of IMF, it has board of governors, an executive board, a managing director, and the staff. The budget of IMF comes from the subscription by members and borrowing. Every member is required to subscribe to the fund an amount equivalent to its quota. Each member is assigned a quota expressed in the special drawing rights. Now, let's understand the second Bretton Woods institution, that is the World Bank. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was, as we all know, a Bretton Woods institution, post Second World War institution, established in 1945. It has two other affiliated institutions, that is International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which was established in 1956, and International Development Association, established in 1960. The membership of IMF is very important to understand, is the principal condition for the membership of the bank. The functions of World Bank are to assist in the reconstruction and development of the member states. The World Bank strives to promote foreign investment by means of guarantees or participation in loans and other investments made by private investors. It tries to promote long-aged balanced growth of international trade and maintenance of equilibrium in the balance of payments. An attempt to create now this was about global finance. Let's have a look at international trade too, as this international trade, global trade, is an important anchor of our international economic system too. Now, an attempt was made to create an international organization in order to look after matters of trade and commercial policies. Now, this was as early as 1947 that we are talking about. The Havana Conference is important for us to present as an example, because the Charter for an International Trade Organization was presented at the Havana Conference. Now, this Charter for International Trade Organization was never ratified, primarily due to differences. The American proposal for a general agreement on trade and tariff was later agreed upon, and therefore we see the emergence of GATT, General Agreement on Trades and Tariff. Now, WTO, which emerges from GATT, has indeed come as a long way, because GATT had no formal organization and no elaborate secretariats. So this is important for us to see in our discussion on GATT and WTO, that how international economic system has evolved over a period of time. GATT was a treaty which had its own round of negotiation. What emerged out of the GATT negotiation at the final Uruguay round was the WTO. So when we try to see that how WTO emerged from GATT. Now, GATT was a treaty. It had its own rounds, from Annecy, Dillon round, Kennedy round, Tokyo round. The final round was the Uruguay round, and the Uruguay round led to the establishment of World Trade Organization in 1995. GATT was a treaty. WTO is a international organization. The impact of GATT was just limited to tariff. WTO caters to tariff as well as non-tariff barriers. So, ITO, International Trade Organization, was never ratified due to differences, and therefore once the American proposal for the establishment of General Agreement on Trades and Tariff was agreed upon, therein the General Trade Agreement of Trade and Tariff, which worked with no formal organization and no elaborate secretariat. The GATT negotiations led to the emergence of World Trade Organization in 1995. The principles, that is non-discrimination, and the principles of reciprocity are the anchors and pillars over which the World Trade Organization functions. At the same time, promoting fair and free international trade amongst members, and therefore we see how the several rounds of GATT negotiations today have led and to focus and emphasis on reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers. So therefore, we see that today there have been significant development in the global economy. Dear listeners, it is important to take into account that alongside the Bretton Woods institutions, the global economy is witnessing new anchors and new pillars also. That is, growth of regional economic subsystems, the growth of multinational corporations, and all of it are contributing to globalization. Let us take into account how regional economic subsystems are making an important contribution in our international economic systems. Today, the world that we are living from, the present contemporary international economic scenario has come a long way. Today, from the First World War to Second World War to Cold War and the contemporary time of post-Cold War, the world is no longer bipolar. There was a time when the world was looked at from the perspective of a capitalist liberal democracy bloc versus a communist bloc, wherein there was idea of a socialist economy. Today the world is no longer living in that bipolarity. We are living at a world where there are multiple power centers, be it BRICS, G7 has been expanded to G20. Now these regional economic subsystems have their own impact on the international economic system. At the same time, today multinational corporations are operating at forums wherein the state has moved back, market has come in to fill in the vacuum. Some of the profits of some of the multinational corporations are equivalent to GDP of a particular country. Today, multinational corporations are existing in every phase of life, from food to healthcare to fast-moving consumer goods to oil and so many more. So therefore, multinational corporations are having a major stake too in the international economic system. And all these things, that is rise of new multiple power centers, rise of multinational corporations adding more to profits, providing jobs, providing more choices, they are somewhere have paved way for a world which has been defined by globalization, integration, exchange. So therefore we see right from the gold standard to the breakdown of this gold standard, to the Bretton Woods conference and emergence of Bretton Woods institutions, to the breakdown of Bretton Woods system to the international economic system has indeed come a long way. So therefore, at the same time, when we see these multinational corporations, they definitely add to liberalization and process of free trade and exchange, but at the same time they have their threats. That is, they pose a threat to national economic autonomy, and therefore it can be aptly said that regionalization and globalization through inter-regional linkages have their own pros as well as own disadvantages. So therefore, one of the benefits of the Bretton Woods system is it has been able to prevent economic nationalism. The Bretton Woods institutions have definitely contributed to increasing international interaction, interchange, interrelation, interdependence, and therefore leading to encouraging of global trade, free trade, and global financial markets. Now, once this Bretton Woods institution also has received setbacks, and one of the peculiarities of international economic system too has been that it has never been static. Variability is something that is always like a constant that we said right in the beginning of the lecture for the international economic system. So therefore, one of the setbacks the international economic system received was in the form of successive oil crisis, the growing instability in the market economies, the fall in the growth rates of industrialized countries. So therefore, Bretton Woods system received its own setback. And let's recall what happened in August 15, 1971. Let me quote to you an example wherein President Nixon, the then United States President, appeared on the television to announce to the world the end of the Bretton Woods system, and that US would no longer abide by the rules and procedures of international monetary order. So therefore, we see that today world has witnessed both rise and fall of the gold standard, both rise as well as crisis within the Bretton Woods system also. Now, within this world order, the idea of a third world is often invoked. Let's understand what does the third world would understand. Third world would understand, for example, Immanuel Wallerstein, the American sociologist, divided the world into three groups: the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. The core, the developed world, the advanced north that we say. The semi-periphery, countries like China, South Africa, India. The periphery, that we often invoke as the third world, that is the underdeveloped countries, wherein resources from their land were used in order to develop the core via the semi-periphery. So therefore, this third world has often invoked its voice, its stake in the operation of the international economic order, and this voice came in the form of NIEO, that is New International Economic Order, and the UNCTAD conference had given this voice. So therefore, this saw the emergence of G77, the group of 77, which time and again tries to meet at various its annual summit in order to put forward the voice of the third world in the operation of the international economic order. Let's talk about NAM, the non-alignment movement, how the developing countries led this movement in order to be safe from the perils of aftermath of the Second World War, because these countries had witnessed imperialism and colonization, wherein the foreign powers came to their land, plundered and extracted resources, and in order to safeguard their newly achieved independence, in order to safeguard their newly attained sovereignty, these countries put forward a third way out during the Cold War, wherein the world was divided in two power blocks, that is capitalist versus communist, and in order to save themselves from these power blocks, they put forward the idea of NAM. So therefore, third world has time and again put forward its voice and its say in the economic system also, in order to negotiate for much favorable terms of trade. The third world has often given the plea for monetary reforms via G77, via NEO. It has always made an attempt to increase in the share of the developing world in the world industrial production. It has made calls for debt relief, because poverty and the problem of debt have a cyclic, vicious connection. So therefore, through forums like G77, through ideas of NEO, the third world has pointed out to the follies and the lacunas and the larger crises that are operating in the economic system, which operates at a level wherein the developed world is given more advantage over the developing world. It has given a call for increase in the development aid, wherein development aid should be in the form of a untied aid. Aid is of two types, that is tied aid versus untied aid. Aid should come in a manner wherein there should not be conditions attached to it. Whenever we try to understand the working of the IMF, the World Bank, the problems with their loans is the problem of SAP, Structural Adjustment Program, wherein there are conditions attached, and these conditions definitely cast a huge question mark on the national sovereignty and political economy of the state too. So therefore, the third world has been making attempt, that is pleas for monetary reforms, increase in the share of developing countries in world industrial production, the issues of debt relief, and the issue and focus on development aid. So therefore, when we try to understand third world, one must invoke new international economic order, which was promulgated in United Nations Declaration in 1974, and this can be said as or looked upon as a transnational governance reform initiative of the 1970s, whose objective was to transform the governance of the global economy, and above all, it was a clarion call for a democratic global order. So time and again we see, be it be the Genoa Conference post First World War, be it be the Bretton Woods Conference post Second World War, be it be NEO, that was during the Cold War, somewhere there have been attempts to tackle and adjust and adapt the international economic system as per the realities of the time, in order to make it much more representative of the issues of the world economy. Now, when we try to understand the international economic order, a significant aspect of it has been COMCON. Now, this COMCON has its origins during the Cold War, wherein as we know that the world was divided into two power blocks. At one point, it was the United States that was leading the capitalist bloc, wherein Marshall Plan was used to dole out development and aid to countries which had suffered during the Second World War, and in order to present an idea of reconstruction of war-torn countries in the post-Second World War scenario, Marshall Plan doled out huge amount of aid to certain countries. And at the same time, NATO was curated as a strategic defense cooperative measure. Now, as a response to that, the USSR, which was leading the communist bloc, invoked the idea of COMCON, and therein there was this Warsaw Pact. So what we see that members therein were united with their commitment to Marxism, Leninism, Soviet style, and this also brings to two very heavy debates in the economic order, that is, what kind of mechanism do we need? Do we need the idea of a liberal capitalist wherein there is free flow of goods and services, wherein we have operation of democracy, or do we need the idea of socialism where we have central planning? Planning by central agencies dominates the economic development paradigm, and within this, as we just saw, in order to safeguard themselves between these two extremes of an open economy versus a closed economy, of free market deciding goods and services prices versus central planning, nations also opted for the third way out, and India is an example here, that is mixed economy, that is prevalence of private and public sector both. The government and market coexist side by side. So COMCON, that was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. It had its run from 1949, that was post Second World War, or the dawn of the Cold War, till 1991, that was a time where there was end of the Cold War and collapse of the USSR. This was an economic organization under the leadership of Soviet Union that comprised countries of the Eastern Bloc, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Cuba too also joined, along with a number of socialist states elsewhere in the world. And COMCON presents to us an idea what it really means to be on the path of socialism. Now, dear listeners, though Cold War has ended, USSR has been dissolved because of its own internal dynamics, till today there is a debate that is socialism still valid. So now what we see here is that COMCON, one of its utilities was that it served as an organizational counterweight to two aspects. At one point you had what we just saw, the Marshall Plan, wherein the United States was doling out huge amount of funds for the new countries that had witnessed the aftermath of the Second World War, and a European iron and steel community. Do remember how the year 1952, 53, 54 were important, wherein Europe was making an attempt to safeguard its economic and commercial interests. The aftermath of that today is the European Union. Now, the last aspect in the evolution of international economic system, dear listeners, is globalization. Now, globalization definitely is a fashionable word. It means many things to many people because it's just describing the trends which are having a dramatic and relentless impact on all of us. There is increase in connections and communications. The markets today are less and less segmented by national boundaries. Today there is space-time compression, and within this space-time compression, the idea of globalization, that is free movement of goods, trades and services, is here to stay. Now always remember, the movement of goods and services has never been new. It has existed way back since the Silk Route. But what is peculiar about this globalization is that it is driven by neoliberal forces, and these neoliberal forces are much more dramatic, rampant and relentless today. This impact of globalization is having its impact on several other sectors too. At the political level, markets are impeding on the space of the state. At the economic level, there is free trade of goods and services. Capital is highly mobile, but at the same time labor is not. At the cultural level, today these economic forces are making us towards a certain kind of new kinds of cultural segmentation, cosmopolitanism. At the societal level too, there has been rise of new norms and values that are leading to standardization of the world at one place. At the same time, diversity of the world is being questioned. So today when we see that communication revolution are making transactions easier, faster and cheaper at the international economic system level, at the same time, dear listeners, there is a caution. Let's not forget the disturbances in the international finance beginning in Europe in 1992, followed by Mexico in 1994-95, climaxed by East Asia in 1997-98, or the current deglobalization syndrome, wherein be it be the Paris Peace Agreement or be it be pulling out of Trans-Pacific Agreement, the United States is pulling out of international trade and governance. So therefore, we are witnessing a phase wherein we are really staring at a phase that are we headed towards a new narrative, a new version of globalization, that is deglobalization. The issues of economic nationalism and a protectionist economy with respect to what benefits an open economy can be given were debated, what we pointed out, right at the aftermath of the First World War, and these questions are also being debated at the current scenario where the benefits of globalization are being challenged, and somewhere the world is looking at a scenario where globalization is being invoked to be reversed. Nonetheless, there are forces that will ensure that the global world economy moves at its own pace. So dear listeners, what we see that today, international economic system, in our lecture today, we see that it has come a long way in its evolution, right from how after the First World War, gold standard was challenged, and in pre-First World War time, gold standard led to hegemony of the Britain. To the Geneva Conference, wherein somewhere United States gave in a call for having a exchange rate stability, and therefore being a creditor, it made a call for debt repayment. Now, with the outbreak of the Second World War, world was under huge crisis, and in order to manage global trade and finance, the Bretton Woods Conference gave the platform for the Bretton Woods institutions, which too face its challenges. Today, US is no longer the only power center. We are living in a world which is multipolar. Today, US currency is not the only currency. Today, we are having multiple currencies having their own state and own say in the global financial markets. Today, alongside this Bretton Woods institution, a significant anchor of global economy has been the multinational corporations, and at the same time, this international economic system has witnessed a competing perspective and ideology too from the socialist states also. And lastly, not forget that though globalization has been the buzzword, but it is being challenged. So therefore, the evolution of international economic system has come a long way. It is here to stay. It is still evolving and presenting to us new options, new choices, new concepts in the realm of meeting challenges and of course catering to new opportunities.